It was the day I had dreamed about since I was a little girl, my wedding day. I'd imagined a day filled with love, laughter, and joyful tears. But reality had a different plan. The moment I arrived at the venue, my stomach was knotted with anxiety. It wasn't wedding jitters. It was a palpable sense of dread, and it came with a name. "Margaret, you do look lovely, but are you sure you don't want to change that hairstyle?" Cynthia was quick to offer her unsolicited opinion as she waltzed into the bridal suite where I was getting ready. "Thanks, Cynthia. I like my hair this way," I responded, teeth gritted. This was far from the first aggressive jab she'd thrown my way, but the audacity to do it on my wedding day was astounding. My mother gave Cynthia a sharp look, but chose not to say anything, knowing it was my day and not wanting to escalate things. My best friend and maid of honor, Rachel, wasn't as restrained. "Margaret looks beautiful just the way she is," Rachel retorted, eyeing Cynthia as if she was something distasteful. Cynthia rolled her eyes. I was just offering some motherly advice. Rachel wanted to say more, but I shot her a glance that said, "It's not worth it." So, with a deep breath, we let it go, returning to the hair and makeup process. As we exited the bridal suite to make our way to the aisle, I couldn't shake off the tension. It was like a thick fog, suffocating the happiness out of the occasion. My dad looked at me, concern etching his features. "You okay, sweetie?" "I will be, Dad. It's just nerves, I guess," I lied. I knew it wasn't just nerves. It was the looming presence of my future mother-in-law and the seeming indifference of my soon-de-husband. I glanced over to where Eric was standing near the altar, talking to his best man. He looked up briefly, and our eyes met, but instead of the warm, comforting look I'd hoped to see, his gaze was flat, almost emotionless. It was as if he was more interested in getting through the ceremony than savoring the moment. I felt a lump form in my throat. As I began to walk down the aisle, arm in arm with my dad, the world around me blurred into a whirlpool of faces. I was hyper, aware of Cynthia's scrutinizing gaze, dissecting every detail of my dress, my makeup, my hair, like a vulture circling its prey. But what hurt the most was Eric's lack of emotion, his absence of enthusiasm. It was like he was there, but not really there. When we finally said our vows, his words felt mechanical, rehearsed but not felt. "I, Eric, take you, Margaret, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, for better or worse." For better or worse, I repeated in my head. If only I had known then how much worse would come to define our marriage, I might have turned and run right then and there. But instead, I stood there, putting on a brave face and clinging to the frayed edges of a dream that was unraveling before it even began. As we were pronounced husband and wife, and Eric leaned in for the obligatory kiss, I felt like I was sealing my fate, locking myself into a life that was already suffused with tension and judgment. The crowd erupted in polite applause, but all I could hear was the deafening silence of my own misgivings. As we exited the aisle, now man and wife, Cynthia came over and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "You've caught yourself a good one, Margaret. Don't mess it up." Little did she know, the person who would mess things up was standing right next to me, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but here, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. And so, amid the wilted smiles and the weight of unspoken words, my wedding day came to an end, laying the foundation for a marriage that was anything but a fairy tale. If I had any illusions that things would change for the better after the wedding, they were shattered in the first week of our cohabitation. The tension I had felt on my wedding day became a constant background noise, the soundtrack to a marriage that had gone off. Kai from the start. We moved into my house, a cozy 3-bedroom I had bought with the money I'd been saving since my early 20s. My online job as a software developer was stable, offering good pay and flexibility, something I was immensely grateful for, especially now. Eric, on the other hand, was still in, between jobs, though what that really meant was that he was caught in an endless loop of job applications, rejections, and a whole lot of procrastination. The trouble didn't take long to arrive, in the form of Cynthia's now painfully frequent visits. These visits became the bane of my existence, each one more intrusive and unbearable than the last. She would usually arrive without notice, letting herself in with the spare key we'd regretfully given her for emergencies. "Margaret, dear, you really should consider taking a cooking class. This chicken is awfully dry," Cynthia would declare as she picked at the dinner I'd cooked, her nose crinkling in disdain. "Maybe Eric could join me in that cooking class," I suggested pointedly. "It would be a fun couples activity." Eric glanced at me, his expression one of annoyance. "I don't have time for cooking classes, Margaret. I'm busy trying to find a job." "Yes, I'm sure those 8 hours you spent gaming today will land you a position soon, I retorted, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. Cynthia's eyes glimmered with a mixture of amusement and triumph. You shouldn't speak to my son like that. He's under a lot of stress. The same theme repeated itself in various forms over and over. Cynthia would criticize how I kept the house, belittling my efforts at every turn. One would think, with a job that lets you stay at home, you'd find the time to clean a bit better, she'd say, pointing at a non-existent speck of dust on the living room table. It's not easy to manage a full-time job and take care of the house, Cynthia. Maybe if someone else pitched in every once in a while, it wouldn't be so hard. I'd snap back, glaring at Eric, who would typically be sprawled on the couch, engrossed in his phone or a video game. Stop ganging up on my son, Cynthia would interject, jumping to his defense as if he was a helpless child. He's doing his best. He's not the one being criticized for everything he does, I'd argue. Eric would usually choose this moment to leave the room, avoiding confrontation and leaving me alone to bear the brunt of his mother's criticisms. Eric, are you not going to say anything to your mother? I'd ask him later once Cynthia had left and we were alone. She's just set in her ways, Margaret. You know how she is, he'd reply, his voice devoid of emotion as if he was commenting on the weather rather than our deteriorating relationship. It was a cycle of disappointment and frustration that played out in different settings, but always ended the same way, with me feeling like I was fighting a battle on two fronts and losing on both. So there it was, the dreary landscape of my marriage, not even a year old and already marred by the constant intrusions and criticisms of a mother-in-law who wouldn't let go and a husband who wouldn't stand up. It was a far cry from the life I had envisioned, a life where my partner and I faced challenges and joys together. Instead, I found myself increasingly isolated, grappling with the growing realization that the man I had married was not the ally I'd hoped for, but rather a silent accomplice to my unhappiness. Life has a way of turning the implausible into the unbearable, and this lesson was driven home the day Cynthia showed up at our doorstep, bags in tow. Eric and I had barely gotten through breakfast, a terse affair where we exchanged as few words as possible, when the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Eric said, almost leaping from his seat. He returned with his mother following closely behind, her face adorned with a smug smile that set off alarm bells in my head. "Margaret, darling, I hope you don't mind. I've decided to move in," Cynthia announced, as if she was doing me a favor. "Move in? With us?" I stammered, glancing at Eric, who avoided my eyes. "Yes, isn't it wonderful? I've been feeling so lonely, and I thought this would be the perfect solution," she beamed, oblivious to my growing horror. "Eric, can I talk to you for a moment?" I asked, pulling him aside into the kitchen. "What the hell is going on? Your mother can't just decide to live with us," I hissed, trying to keep my voice down. "She's been struggling emotionally lately. She needs family around," Eric mumbled, finally meeting my eyes. "So, you thought you'd offer her our home without even discussing it with me? We'll figure it out, Margaret. She's my mother, after all," he said, shrugging as if that explained everything. That was the beginning of my descent into domestic hell. From the first day, Cynthia made it abundantly clear that her move wasn't a visit, but an invasion. She criticized how I organized the kitchen, rearranged furniture to her liking, and commandeered the main bathroom as if she was the lady of the house. "Margaret, you really should consider using a different detergent. The one you use smells so cheap," she would comment while I did the laundry. "It's eco-friendly and non-toxic, Cynthia," I'd reply through gritted teeth. "Oh, one of those new age fads. Well, in my day, we prioritize cleanliness over politics," she'd retort, turning her nose up. The tension in the house was palpable, and yet Eric did nothing to mediate. He immersed himself further into his job searching, which still involved hours of gaming and watching TV. One evening, after Cynthia had spent the entire day berating me for how I stacked the dishwasher, cooked dinner, and even folded the towels, I had enough. "Eric, your mother's constant nagging and criticism are driving me insane. Can't you see that the situation is not sustainable?" I confronted him after dinner. "Margaret, you're making a big deal out of nothing. She's just trying to help," he replied dismissively. "Help? You think undermining me at every turn is her way of helping? I can't change how my mother is, and I can't change how you feel. You're both adults. Figure it out," he said, before walking away. The audacity of his indifference left me stunned. Not only did I have a mother-in-law who made my life miserable, but I also had a husband who refused to acknowledge the problem, much less work on a solution. My home, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a battleground where every day brought a new struggle. It wasn't just a question of enduring Cynthia's insidious remarks or Eric's apathy anymore. It was about retaining some semblance of my own identity, my own peace of mind in a place that should have been filled with love but was overrun by resentment and bitterness. This living arrangement wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a crisis, one that called for drastic action. I just didn't know then how drastic things would get. The cracks in the facade of our relationship couldn't be ignored anymore. By now, my home felt like a stranger's, each room tainted by Cynthia's oppressive presence and Eric's stunning indifference. But it was the moment I found out I was pregnant that everything, every resentment, every disappointment came into sharp focus. I decided to share the news over dinner, a meal I'd painstakingly prepared in an attempt to create some semblance of normalcy. My hands trembled as I set the plates on the table. "I have something to tell you both," I began, my eyes meeting Eric's briefly before shifting to Cynthia's skeptical gaze. "I'm pregnant!" Eric's face turned ashen, his eyes widening in disbelief. "I'm pregnant, Eric! We're going to have a baby!" Instead of the joy or even mild happiness I had expected, Eric's expression transformed into one of sheer dread. Cynthia, however, laughed. A cold, piercing sound that echoed through the room. "Well, that's no surprise," she sneered. "Haven't you been leading off Eric long enough? Now you've trapped him for good?" I felt like I'd been slapped. Trapped him. I've been the one supporting this household while Eric looks for a job. Eric finally spoke, his voice quivering. The room spun. The man I'd married, the man who was supposed to be my partner, had just shattered whatever was left of our relationship. "You've been what?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been unfaithful. I didn't plan for this pregnancy, and I'm not ready to be a father," he said, looking anywhere but at me. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. Not only was my husband unwilling to stand by me, but he had also been betraying me all along. And there, enjoying every moment of my despair, was Cynthia. At that point, she made her most audacious move yet. She stood up and slapped me across the face. "You've been nothing but a burden to my son. This is your fault." It was surreal. The sharp pain in my cheek mirrored the emotional turmoil roiling within me. But as my eyes met Eric's, his gaze filled not with regret or concern, but with relief. I realized something crucial. I had been fighting for a relationship that had never truly existed. Eric had not just cheated on me with another woman. He had cheated me out of love, trust, and the happiness that every person deserves. And Cynthia was not just a terrible mother-in-law. She was a toxic human being whose mission was to perpetuate her son's failures and blame them on me. As I stood there in the ruins of my marriage and the life I'd built, a cold clarity washed over me. I would not let them define me. I would not let them win. The time for passive resistance, for tolerating the intolerable, was over. Eric may have shattered my illusions, but in doing so, he gave me something invaluable, the will to break free. I looked at both of them, my eyes dry, my resolve hardened by the betrayals I'd endured. "You know what? You two deserve each other," I said, breaking the heavy silence. "But neither of you deserves a place in my life. Not anymore." As I walked away from the table, leaving behind the man I'd married and the woman who'd made my life a living hell, I knew it was the end of a miserable chapter, but it was also the beginning of something else, my long-awaited freedom, my ultimate revenge. In that moment, I promised myself they would come to regret this day, and I would do whatever it took to ensure it. The legal process felt like an eternity, but it was my lifeline, the pathway to my liberation. I found a top-notch divorce attorney who specialized in cases of domestic abuse and marital betrayal. To lay the groundwork, I documented every vile thing Cynthia had done, every hurtful word, and every instance of Eric's indifference and betrayal. The court date arrived, and as I walked into the courtroom, my heels clicked against the polished floor with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. My attorney, Miss Jennifer Davis, walked beside me, a reassuring presence in this storm of chaos. Eric and Cynthia were already there, huddled in a corner with their lawyer, their faces twisted with an anxiousness that fueled my resolve. This was it, the day of reckoning. "Mrs. Margaret Thompson," the judge intoned as the proceedings began, "you filed for divorce on the grounds of marital infidelity and emotional and physical abuse, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice unwavering. "Mr. Eric Thompson, how do you plead to these allegations?" "I've made mistakes, Your Honor, but I never abused my wife," Eric said, trying to sound sincere but failing miserably. "Is that so? Let's hear the evidence," the judge declared, signaling for my attorney to begin. Missims. Davis presented our case with the precision of a surgeon. Photos, text messages, financial records. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of Eric and Cynthia's lies. Furthermore, Your Honor, Jennifer said, handing over a medical report, my client has been subjected to physical violence, as is evidenced by this documentation of a slap across the face by the defendant's mother, Mrs. Cynthia Thompson. Cynthia's face flushed a shade of red that could rival a tomato. The audacity to victim blame in court, Mrs. Davis countered, rolling her eyes. Your Honor, we request full dissolution of the marriage child support and damages for emotional and physical suffering. After the judge listened to both sides, he leaned back in his chair, seemingly weighing the gravity of the situation. Mr. Thompson, you are ordered to pay child support in accordance with state guidelines, he said, scribbling on a piece of paper. Furthermore, you are both to vacate Mrs. Thompson's residence within 2 weeks. Mrs. Cynthia Thompson, you will pay $60,000 in damages for emotional and physical abuse. The room was silent, save for Cynthia's muffled sobs. Eric looked like he had been slapped in the face, much like how I had been, physically and emotionally, for years. Outside the courtroom, they both approached me, their faces masks of desperation. Margaret, please reconsider. Where will we go? Eric begged. Yeah, Margaret. For the sake of family, Cynthia added, her voice softer now, stripped of its usual venom. I looked them both in the eyes, savoring the moment I'd been waiting for. You should have thought of family before ruining this one. Goodbye, Eric. Goodbye, Cynthia. And with that, I turned and walked away, each step echoing with the sweet, indescribable sound of freedom. It was the end of a dark chapter and the beginning of something new, something mine. My home would once again be my sanctuary, and my child would grow up in a loving environment, free from the toxic legacy Eric and Cynthia had tried to impose. It was more than just the end of a marriage and a legal victory. It was a reclaiming of my life, a redefinition of my worth, and the ultimate revenge on those who had tried to break me. The struggle was far from over, but for the first time in years, I was the one in control, and I couldn't help but relish it. 2 weeks had never felt so slow, and yet so fast. The countdown to Eric and Cynthia's eviction was both a relief and a tense buildup to the day I had longed for, my final emancipation. They spent the weeks looking for places to live, their frenzied phone calls filling the house like a chorus of desperation. I, on the other hand, had been working on rebuilding my life. I was consulting with my lawyer about the child support logistics and the asset division, which was almost entirely in my favor, given that the house and the majority of our finances were in my name. I had also started seeing a therapist who helped me understand that I was not the one to blame for the hellish years I had endured. Finally, the day arrived. I heard Cynthia dragging her suitcases down the stairs, grunting with every step. Eric followed her, lugging his own set of baggage, both literal and metaphorical. They stood awkwardly at the front door, their eyes avoiding mine as I approached. Everything's out, I asked, scanning the room to ensure they hadn't left anything behind. Yes, Eric replied, his voice tinged with bitterness that no longer had any effect on me. Then I guess this is goodbye, I said, holding out a pen and the final eviction papers that confirmed their departure. Eric grabbed the pen, scribbling his name hastily. Cynthia followed, her signature shaky, as if the gravity of her actions had finally caught up with her. Margaret, you didn't have to do this, Eric said, handing back the papers. I didn't have to, I agreed, but I chose to, for my well-being and for the well-being of my child. Cynthia chimed in, her voice cracking. Don't you think this is too harsh? Families work through issues. They don't just throw each other away? I laughed at the irony. Family! You've never treated me like family, Cynthia. And you, Eric, you gave up that privilege the moment you betrayed me. I opened the front door wide, gesturing for them to leave. I hope life teaches you the lessons you both so desperately need to learn, I said, as they stepped out. Just remember, Margaret, you're alone now, Eric said, looking back one last time. I'd rather be alone than live another day with the two of you, I responded, meeting his gaze with a finality that felt like the closing of a book. With that, I shut the door behind them, listening as their footsteps faded into the distance. I locked the door and walked through the now empty rooms, a mixture of melancholy and relief washing over me. For so long, this space had been a battleground, but now it was once again my sanctuary. I sat down on the couch, my hands cradling my belly, thinking about the life growing inside me. This child would never know the toxicity that had once festered in this home. They would know love, support, and the empowerment that comes from standing up for oneself. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from my therapist, reminding me of our next session. I smiled, thinking about the support system I was building, the future that lay ahead of me, a future built on my terms. Eric and Cynthia were now figures in the rearview mirror, shrinking further and further away until they disappeared over the horizon of my life. And as they vanished, so did the weight of my past, leaving me with something incredible: the freedom to live, to love, and to be myself without apology or regret. It was the end of an era, a final goodbye to the years of struggle and heartache. And it was the beginning of something beautiful, a life where the only person I had to answer to was me.